No, because they're all Tuesdays and Wednesdays.
All right, welcome everybody. Luckily, our metro problems of last week have solved themselves, so that was great for me today. Didn't have to sit on metro for 2 hours. Love that. So last week was probably the most concept heavy of the course. We went through a bunch of different things. We went through variables, and conditionals, and functions, and debugging, and all of this stuff. It was very concept heavy. And this week we're going to really spend some time refreshing those things and using them in labs. So we're going to take those skills and really apply them. So hopefully at the end of this week, we have all the whirlwind of last week will now be comfortable to go out and use on our own. Because really, I think where most of us are at right now is we understand these things somewhat individually as concepts, but when it comes to taking these food and other things and see what happens. Body parts, that's it. Important thing is to never double back. Don't try to correct yourself. Just let it hang. Okay. All right, we're back. Let me make sure the hangout is okay. The hangout is not okay. Okay, so a quick look at the agenda. I was really confused. I kept going back and forth on the order of the first two things. Either do the review first or the first. I think I'm actually going to swap these two. I think I'm going to do the review first. Since a lot of people weren't here last for Metro, I'm going to do that as like a primer to get us thinking in the right way, and then take a look at the cash register as a review. We're going to talk about one little part of functions that we didn't quite get to on Wednesday, and that's something called anonymous functions. We've seen these so far. We've seen them. We just haven't put a name to them, okay? And so we're going to add that more formally and then use that in the cash register example. And then finally, the last 100 minutes of class or so, we're just going to work on that lab that we started briefly last class. Or not last class, on Monday, actually, a week ago. Okay, so some review. Okay, I'm going to go back 2 classes ago. Started variables, right? We learned about variables being containers values. And one interesting thing that we talked about last class is not only do we need variables when we need to keep track of something over the lifetime of a program, right? From the beginning of the program and then on each subsequent click or whatever it may be, but also from line to line, right? And so we can illustrate that by looking at the difference between these 2 lines. lines, okay? So this top line is saying find the element with the ID city type. And if you have been working on the homework, you'll recognize that was an input element in our HTML. And it's saying get the value of that input, right? The user inputted value out of that input. So can somebody describe to me the difference between this line here and this line here? Matt, yeah.
The first one, it pulls it out, but then it just goes away. You can't recall.
Exactly.
We're sending it to access that information clearly.
Exactly. Introduce this concept like floating off into the ether, right? So in this first line, we're getting that value, but we then have no way to access it later in our program. We have no way to refer to that ever again. We've got it, we've done all this work, but it's all for naught because we haven't stored it anywhere. And so here, we're doing the same thing, but we're storing the result of this into this variable called city, right? And so that's the difference between these two things. And we'll see this over and over again. If we need to compute the value and then use it again later in our program, we'll need to store it in a variable to access it. Okay? Any questions on variables? Some things that we can store in variables, right? We talked about three things specifically: numbers, strings, and booleans. Numbers we're pretty familiar with. Integers are whole numbers. Floats are, sort of decimal type numbers like pi or something like that. 0.333, a third would be a float number. We talked about strings being text, right? So anything like a name or text that we put into our HTML, that would all be strings. Also, if you've noticed, when we use jQuery, the CSS selector that we put into jQuery is also a string, right? And we've seen that. And then finally, booleans, which just are true or false, always one of those two values. And these we use to represent so things that are, in one state or the other. So things that are on or off, things that are true or false, things that are right or wrong, right? So those are, when it's a very binary relationship, like a 0, 1, 0 relationship, it's one or the other, you use something like a boolean, okay? All right, so let's talk about each of those a little bit more. So each of these things is a number, right? So the first thing here, 4, this is obviously a number, right? This is, what kind of number is that? It's an integer, right? It's a whole number, no decimal point. So that would be just an integer. And this number here, what kind of number is that? Somebody else? Anybody? It's a float, right? It's a float. It's a number that has a decimal number, and therefore it's a float. Okay. We also looked at this, right? So we can take a string that has a number in it, right? So this is a string. It has quotes around it, but it has a number in it, and we can parse that string for the integer inside of it. So the result of parsing this string here with the number 4 in it is going to be the number 4 rather than the string 4. Okay. So parsing this string here is going to give us this. Does that make sense? So that's how we convert something from a string to a number, and we've seen why we need to do that, and we'll see it again here in a minute. And then likewise, we do the same thing for floats. So if we want to take some string that looks like a float and parse it and turn it into a number, we do that using parse float. Okay, so sometimes we need to convert between types, and it's one way that we can do that.
Would there be a case that you wouldn't, like if there's an input and you didn't know whether it's going to be an integer or a float based on what somebody puts in?
Yeah.
Like you would want to convert it into a number. How would you?
So how would you guess? So it's right. So if it's something where you might need decimals in some occasions and not in others, then there's no harm in always parsing it as a float, right?
Yeah.
So you can always parse it as a float. It would just be like 0.0, something of that nature, right? Yeah, that's a good question. But there are times, right, where whole numbers are the only things that make sense. Right? If we're counting, for instance, apples. We would want whole apples, not I don't know why we're counting apples. It's just the first thing that popped in my head. So, or sheep, maybe that's a better one. Okay, so let's look at some strings. We talked about there's different ways to represent strings, meaning that we can use different types of quotes, right? We can use single quotes or double quotes, are both fine. Usually you choose one or the other and you're consistent with it. I like single quotes. I think Paul said he liked double quotes. Is that right? You double quotes? That was you, right? Fairly certain.
Honestly, I switch back and forth. I don't really care, but I was just being.
Well, now you're stuck with it.
Devil's
So.
advocate, some might say.
Well, you're stuck with it now. So you can have either of these, right? One, when you use single quotes, is when your string itself contains quotes. So here is a sentence where I said, hello world. And inside that string, we can see there's a double quote. So we need the single quotes to show where the string begins and ends. Okay, so that's one situation where it matters. And then also we talked about how we can smush strings together doing this operation called concatenation. We can smush them together by using the plus sign. So where the plus sign means addition, when we have numbers, it's the plus sign means smush them together, concatenate them together. And so in this case, if I have some variable name, we'll say it's Jacob, the value of this. The full result of this would be Jacob said hello world. So we're smushing those things together. And so that would be very much like this, except for it's say Jacob instead of bye. Any questions on this? No? Okay. And, sort of in contrast, Booleans are very simple. They're either true or false. That's all they can ever be. And so, here we have basically infinite possibilities for strings, right? Booleans can only be two values, either true or false. Okay. So the next thing we talked about were conditionals. Right, and we kind of said this is how we make decisions in our programs. Whether it be, what city was inputted by the user to change a background conditionally, or whether it be knowing if the score was good enough to pass the test, or whatever the context is. A conditional is how we make some decisions. Other decisions we might make using conditionals in some, fixed application. Imagine, if you will. I don't know. Use your imagination. Or you can talk about like work on in class. What are some other examples of how we might use conditionals? You don't get to answer, sorry. Kevin.
The project that we're going to work on, if it's designated cold, the background should be blue. If it's then it should be whatever. Exactly.
If we need to decide whether or not the temperature that was entered by the user, say, is hot or cold, that is a prime example for a conditional. Anything else? We've talked about a lot of these, so surely somebody can think of something else. Yeah.
And then test with the background green.
Yeah, exactly. So if we need to determine whether or not in a quiz a answer that was provided was the correct answer or the incorrect answer, we can use a conditional to make that distinction and change the background accordingly. Totally. Awesome. How do we compare things in these conditionals? We can use these comparison operators. And we saw a bunch of them. One common one that we use a lot is this triple equals, which means, check for equality. So are two things equal to each other? Which is different than, right? Triple equal sign is assigning a value to a variable, whereas three equal sign is asking a question: are these things equal? Okay. We can also do, regular inequalities like greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, and then we can also, I've seen before, but exclamation point equal equal, which means not equal. So the opposite of equal. Okay, so let's look at something interesting here. So far seen comparisons only in the context of conditionals, but we can use them in other places too. So here, remember when we're doing a variable assignment, the way that we want to read that line is we want to read the right-hand side first, find the result of that, and then the result is stored into this variable, right? Take a look at this for a second, and when you think you know the value of my variable, raise your hand. Got one. So remember, triple equals is asking a question. It's saying, is the left-hand side equal to the right-hand side? So what's the value here of my variable? Anybody? Exactly. It's true. It's being true. Because 4 is equal to 4, right? So the answer to that question is yes, or true. Okay? And so the result is a Boolean, and that Boolean is going to be stored in my variable. So does everybody see this? The number 4 is equal to the number 4, so the result of this comparison is true. So true will be stored in my variable.
How / when would you use that?
Well, you would never use it in this case where I'm on either side, right? But if I had two variables that I don't necessarily know the value of, if I wanted to say have a variable called is input San Francisco, right? I can do the string San Francisco, and then I'd have a Boolean that represents is input San Francisco. So I just want to illustrate that the result of this, right, is a Boolean. Okay, that's really what I wanted to illustrate here, and that's why it works in a conditional, because what it can for is either true or false. It's looking for a Boolean in order to make that decision. Okay. So then, what is the value of my other variable?
False.
Yeah. It's not true, right? It's false. 9 is not less than 7. That statement is false. And thus, the value of the other variable is false. So if I were to console log my other variable, what would I see? Well, let's actually take a look at it. So I'm opening up my dev tools here. In the console, I'm going to make a var, my other variable, and I'm going to assign it the value 9 is less than. Okay, great. Now I can look at that. Actually, what I type in my program is this. I type in console.log my other variable, right? And I should see false, right? Indeed, I see false. Right? And that's because this statement here is not true, right? It's false. And thus that value is being stored in my other variable. So confused about that? Or have questions? Now I could use my other variable in a conditional, and I can say console log here when I hit enter here, do you think I'm going to see here in the console? So look at this. I'm saying if my other variable, then log here in the console. Do you think I'm going to see that when I execute this? I see some head shakes. Exactly, because the value of this variable is false. And an if statement means if the value in these parentheses is true, then execute this code. That's what it means. Very literally, that's what it means. Okay. So if the value in these parentheses is true, execute the code inside of the curly brackets. That's what it means. We know that my other variable is not true. It's false. And thus, we're not going to see anything in the browser, in the console. Okay. So we have this intuitive sense of how these conditionals are working. But this is how they're really working for a Boolean, true or false, and making their decision based on that Boolean. And the result of these equality checks is Boolean. Okay. So, and here is the flow of a check, right? The first check is always going to start with if, and we're going to then evaluate this condition inside of the parentheses and see if that thing is true or false. And if it's true, we'll run this line of code and we're done. If it's not true, we're going to try the next else if, right? And then we'll see if this one is true. If that, let's execute this line of code and then we're done. If none of those things are true, we'll go to the else and run that code and be done. Okay. So for each line here, we're checking to see if the thing in parentheses is true, right? Is Boolean true? And running the code if it is. And if it's not, we're going to the next one, and finally this one if none of the above are true. So if my score is 9, what am I going to see? Exactly. If my score is 9, I will see in my console close, try harder, right? Because 9 is not greater than or equal to 10. So this statement will be false. However, 9 is greater than or equal to 5. So I will jump in here and run that code, and now I'm done. Okay? So this is the flow of the decision making when we use conditionals. We can use if, we can use if to check additional conditions, and then finally we can use else to say, if none of those things are true, do this. Sort of like the, the default or if all else fails mechanism. Okay, everybody cool with this? Okay, the next thing is and or operators, okay? And what these allow you to do is to combine comparisons together, okay? So we saw this in the homework. If you were working on homework, we wanted to see, if the user's input was equal to New York or NYC, right? Not just one of them. We wanted to check multiple conditions. And anytime we want to check, see multiple things, we do see and ors to join those things together. Okay. Let me illustrate something else. So what we can talk about this example, right? This top one is saying if the user input, let's say, this variable here stands for the user's input. If the user's input is capitalized Jacob or lowercase Jacob, if either of those things are true, then we're going to run this console log greetings, right? Yes.
Is it always case sensitive?
Yes. Equality checks with strings are always case sensitive. Yes, that is a great point. Yes.
So in the case of the homework, should we put or statements in?
For a lowercase and uppercase?
I'm not going to take off points if you do. However, I will say there's a more elegant way of solving that problem than doing every combination. Okay. Anybody have a guess as to what that might be? Yeah. Totally. Right. So we can take the user's input, force it to lowercase, and then we can compare it to other lowercase strings. Right? Then we have don't have to worry about case sensitivity because we know everything is lowercase. Okay. I'm not going to show you how to do that, but I will say there may be a function called toLowerCase in JavaScript that you can use to do that. But it's, looking that type of thing up is going to be very beneficial. I can describe the general approach. Yes, string equality checks in JavaScript are case sensitive. Yes. So or means if either of these things are true, right? If one is true, the whole thing is true. And means both things must be true. Skies are blue and the clouds are white, then it's a wonderful world, right? But both of those things must be true. So look at it again in the console because I think that's a good way to illustrate this stuff. We say, when we're looking at these conditionals, what we're trying to say is, what Boolean does this whole thing evaluate to? Okay? So we can use these and or operators with just Booleans to see how they work, right? So if I were to write, what do you think the result would be down here when I hit enter? Right, if I were to say true and true, what would be the result when I hit enter? Are both of those things true? Yes. So the result would be true. Right. True and true. True. If I were to say true and false, what would the result be? False, right? When we're using and, the thing on the right and the left have to be true in order for the whole thing to be true. And so now when I hit enter, we'll see false. Now if I was to swap that and or, what will I now see? True, exactly, because if either thing is true, or says the whole thing is true. And so now when I hit enter, it's true. So now we can expand this out, right? So now we're doing it with raw Booleans, but now we checks and start reasoning about what the result will be, right? So if I say 9 is less than 7, or 9 is less than 10, now what's the result going to be? And why is that? Which one? Right, 9 is not less than 7, that's going to be false. However, 9 is less than 10, that's going to be true. And thus, the whole statement is going to be true. So when I hit enter, I'll see true. And just to really drive it home, if I were to change this to and, I'll make it a bit bigger so you can see, change that symbol in the middle to and, now what will we see? Well, if you have a guess, what we see?
It's false.
Exactly, it's false because in order for it to be true, the things on both sides have to be true when we're using and. And we know that 9 less than 7 is going to be false. So we'll see false. So this is a good way to practice these things or play with these things. Whenever you have questions about how they work, you can just open up your developer tools console here and just start messing around. And so, but this is why these things work in conditionals, right? Because they all evaluate to Booleans. And conditionals are looking for Booleans in order to make decisions. Everybody cool with that? Okay. So I'm not going to go into too much step here because you'll have lots of time to practice this during the lab. But we talked about some common debugging approaches, right? And we have different types of problems. So the first type of problem is like the syntactical problem. We've missed a semicolon, we've missed a parenthesis, we spelled a word wrong, something like that. This stuff happens all the time, and it's the kind of problem that causes your entire program to break. And we talked about the best way to start debugging that is to just look at console. Because if anything's broken, you're probably going to see a red error in that console. And it'll even tell you the file and the line number where that error occurred. And you can start looking in the file to start seeing what happened. So that's the first thing we do. And then the next type of problem is the logic problem, right? We thought we knew what we were doing, but we made a mistake in our logic somehow that caused this program not to behave like we expected it to. Maybe a function that we wrote isn't being called and we don't know why. Maybe the value of a variable isn't what we expected it to be. That type of problem, that we can use this console log to just log statements into our develop tools console, and we can see as the program runs what's happening using those log statements. So we can see, if we put a console log statement as the first line of a function, say, we can see every time that function is run, and that can give clue what's in our program. Likewise, we can log a variable throughout our program, and we can see the value of that variable changing as the program progresses. Okay, so that's the second thing we might do. And then the third thing we do is like the really advanced debugging process where we go to the sources tab and we set breakpoints in our code. And we basically tell, we tell the program to say, when you get to this line, say I put it on line 13, when you get to line 13, stop executing, wait there for me, and I'll tell you when to keep going. Right? And then you can step through the code line by line, seeing what the values of variables are, seeing where the program goes, and that way you can get a real feel for what's happening inside your program. Okay? Throw your hands up and Google it, right? That's sort of the next step. It's a step that all of us do many times a day. So that's not defeat, that's resourcefulness. Okay. Any questions on debugging? All right, I'm going through every concept a little bit, and then we're going to get into coding, I promise. So the next thing we talked about on Wednesday were functions, right? And functions, we mentioned, they're very much like our full program, but smaller chunks of sequential steps that we might execute. And they can optionally take input, and they can optionally return output, right? So they don't have to take input necessarily, and they don't have to return output necessarily, but they certainly can do either of those things. Okay? So here's the basic skeleton for a function, right? Here's a function definition, right, where we're defining this function keyword we can think of as being analogous to like a var keyword, right? So we use var to declare a variable. We use the function keyword to define a function. And then this next part here is just its name. We can choose its name. It can be whatever we want it to be. However, we should be able to read that function name and have some idea of what its job is. And furthermore, it should use this camel case structure, where we lowercase the first letter, and then every subsequent word has a capital letter. So that's sort of just a convention that everybody sticks to. All right. So this is where we're defining a function. We can then function or invoke the function, right? We usually use the word call in order to tell a function, do the thing that you are made to do. And that looks like this, right? So up here we're defining it, and here we're calling that function that we defined. Okay, so we write the name, and then we write parentheses, and those parentheses mean call. So you can think of those parentheses as being the actual mechanism that calls the function. So without the parentheses, nothing happens here. So with them, the function's called. Okay? About the inputs to a function, right? And we call these things arguments. Okay? And those are things that we can put in the parentheses as part of the definition of a function. And we can define what inputs this function expects. Okay, so here we're saying this function named add, it expects 2 arguments. It expects 2 pieces of input. And we're just giving them whatever name, just like variables, just like function names. We're just giving them whatever name we want. However, it should be somewhat descriptive of what that input means. And in this case, it's an addition function, right? So it has 2 numbers as input. Okay? And we can have as many pieces of input as we want, or as few, right? We can have 0 pieces of input if we don't need them. But you know, it's just a matter of what the function's job is, whether or not it needs input. So once again, it can take input in the form of arguments, and then processes, does its job, whatever that may be, and then it can return output in the form of return values using a return statement. And we saw that uses this return keyword here, right? So here is what our fully fleshed out add function might look like. We use the function keyword to define a function. We give it the name add because we think that's descriptive of its job, and in this case it is, right? It's a pretty good name. And it takes 2 pieces of input. In this case, we're calling them A and B. We could call them num1, num2. We could call them, foo and bar, whatever we want. In this case, we choose A and B. We're going to then, do some computation. We're going to say that we're going to declare a variable plus sum, and the sum is going to be these 2 things added together, which we might expect. And then we're just going to return that value. And that return statement is the output of the function. So in order for this value to leave the function, we have to use that return statement for it to leave that function and go out of there.
So if we go back to calling, it's the top defining it, and then we're moving to calling the function, where it's my function. Like, is that defining it or calling it?
Is this defining it?
Or when we do the add A and B, is that's defining it?
This is defining it. Yep.
But we haven't called it.
We have. Without this, we would call it, right? This is calling it.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Okay.
You're saying add. Okay.
Yeah, totally. So this, you'll see that skeleton here, right? With the function keyword, the name, the curly braces, the parentheses. This is the definition. Right? This is where we're defining it. Nothing's actually happening yet. We're just defining it. Here, we're calling it. We're using its name and parentheses. This time, however, we're putting things in there, right? The arguments. But this is where we're calling the function. This is when the work actually happens. And then because this returns some value, we need somewhere to store that value, right? And so we're putting that value into a new variable. So this add 1 and 3 is going to return a value of 4, right? It's going to add those 2 things together, return a value of 4, and then we're going to store it in this variable total. And when we go to the next line, we can use total if we want. And that's going to have a value of 4 now. Any questions about this? So, and then, one more thing we talked about is this interesting case of functions called event functions that we've been using specifically to respond to user events, right? So these are the things that we put in parentheses when we do like a .submit or a .click or something like that, or .hover, so we've seen before. This function here is a special kind of function that we call an event, just because its job is to respond to an event, right? So not every function is going to have that role. In fact, we've seen a few that have a role. Like add in the previous one, it's not an event listener, right? It was just a regular function whose job was to add 2 numbers. Here, however, this validate form function is an event listener. It listens listening for the submit event, right, of some form. And these functions, it turns out, receive an optional argument that is the event, okay? And I know this feels weird, and the reason this feels weird is because a lot of this happens behind the scenes in jQuery, right? So a lot of this happens and we don't get to see it. It's almost like magic to us. So for that reason, it's just something we have to know. You know, I don't go in looking at the jQuery source code in order to know how this works. I just know that it works. Right? Like I know that event listeners get this event argument. And the reason we might need that event argument is because in the case of forms, especially, when a form is submitted, it wants to refresh the page. That's what the browser wants to do. It wants to reload the page. That's just default behavior. It makes sense in some context, but most of our applications, we don't want that to happen because we'll lose everything we've done if it refreshes the page. And so we have to tell the browser not to do that, and we do that by using this event.prevent default. Yes?
So is that basically like a function calling a function? It's called a function?
Prevent default is a function, yes.
Okay.
And yes, you can call functions within functions, and it turtles all the way down, right? Yeah, totally. There's no arbitrary limits in JavaScript, you'll realize, or in most programming languages. There's no arbitrary functions, but only if you're not in another function or something like that. Pretty much anything you can do in one place, you can do in another place. Yeah.
Prevent default from JavaScript? Or?
Prevent default is a part of JavaScript when it's running in a browser. Yes. So you could do this in vanilla JavaScript, right? But so happens we're doing this in jQuery, and it's handling all of the background stuff for us. Any more questions about this? Okay. All right, so let's take an early break. We're 15 minutes before regular break, but we're going to get back, and then we're going to be into coding for most of the rest of the class. So now's probably a good time. So just take a quick 5-minute break, and then we'll get back into it. I always know it's time to take a break when my mouth is sitting, but I need more water. So I can feel it. I just got to see an alert that the Apple hearing is canceled for tomorrow. Apparently the FBI thinks they can get into the phone without it.
Yeah, they said they found a way else. I saw it earlier. I bet they bail out it.
We'll see.
The guy came in. No way. Don't do it.
I really wish, well, I guess it's canceled now, but when it was going to happen, I really wish it would have been televised. So I feel like that would have been something to watch.
We still had their today, so that was not as interesting.
It was like we could have a smaller phone and a smaller iPad and more bands. And like, it was just like very. When asking for.
It's not the perfect size yet. We're on our way.
Just right.
It's like markets and it's like it's yeah, I think it's supposed to be like for the pay-as-you-go market.
So from what I heard, it's like it's targeting. So when they released the 6 or the 6 Plus, right? These were huge phones. It was a very large upgrade cycle, one of the biggest in recent memory. But there was like some consumers who didn't upgrade because they liked the size of their phone. So they're trying to target those users that didn't upgrade at that point in time. But I think it's still a developed market phone. I still think it's like a North American, Western Europe phone.
Maybe what I read was United States.
Yeah. I think, I don't know. I mean, it's also speculation.
I mean, it happened, so.
Yeah. On the new phone? Oh, on the government? It's a tricky situation.
Yeah.
Like, I think the most interesting analysis is the one that John Oliver gave, right? It's like, you can't be like staunchly on either side because it's such a complex issue that like, you have to be like an expert in the field to really have a nuanced opinion on it. So it's like, I don't know, it's hard. In general, I'm a fan of privacy. Yeah. That's just me. Okay. Okay, I think we're mostly back. So we're going to take another look at the cash register exercise we did our last class. So if you have the one that you were working on from last class, go ahead and pull it up. If not, I have a version in the starter code that's at the same place we left off. So if you want to use that one, you can as well. So I'm going to go ahead and sync my local repository. So I'm going to open the GitHub desktop app. And, oops, over here. And I'm going to sit in the right-hand corner my FEWD22 repository. And once I have that, I'm going to open that bad boy up in Finder. And then I'm going to go into, I believe already on 7. Jeez. Go into class 12. There's a starter code in there. Go ahead and copy the starter code. And then I'm going to go into my name group and make a new class 12 folder. And just paste in that starter code. Like I said, you want to work from the one we did last time, can. It's at the exact same place as this. So now I'm just going to take this cash register folder, and I'm going to drag that cash register folder to Sublime Text. Okay. So let's go ahead and open this in the browser so we can remind ourselves, what the application was doing, where we, and then we can continue. If we open this in the browser, we can see, remember we have this thing that kind of looks like a receipt, right? And it accepts some user input here at the bottom. And when we hit enter, it's going to create a tally of each of these entries, right? And then it should, when we're all said and done, have the total summed up here at the bottom as well. Okay? let's hop back to the code. I'm going to go into the JavaScript, index.js. So what I'm going to do to review is something that we should also to some extent to our code, and that's I'm going to comment the code in order to illustrate in English, what I'm doing in code. And this is a good practice. This is something that all professional developers do. Very rarely are you going to see code. Well, sometimes it happens and you're unhappy, but very rarely are you going to see code like this with absolute indignation as to what's happened, right? You'd have to be very, very good at writing code to write it in a way that was completely obvious what you're trying to do, right? So sometimes things aren't completely obvious. And for that reason, we should always illustrate what we're doing in English using comments, right? It's just a good practice. It's less work for the next developer to look at the code. It's less work for you 6 months down the road when you barely remember what you were working on, right? It's just good practice in general. So let's go ahead and do that in order to kind of refresh ourselves on what we've done so far. So the first thing I do is I'm going to create a variable here, right at the top, right, and keep track of that running total, right? So keep track of the running total in this variable, right? So the next thing we do on now line 7 here is we're going to find that entry form, right? And we're going to say whenever that form is submitted, we're going to run this function add entry, right? Sometimes we call this whole process, adding event listeners or attaching event listeners, right? So what we're doing is we're adding this add entry function to this event submit, right? So we're attaching our event listeners. Sometimes you'll see like registering event listener. Just say this, but I'm going to use something like that. I'm going to say add event listener to the forms submit event, right? So this is sort of the vernacular that you'll see to describe this type of thing, right? What we're doing is we're adding this add entry event listener function to that forms submit event, right? But we're saying, put another way, when this entry form is submitted, respond by running this add entry function. Okay, so however you like, but this is the sort of the vernacular that you'll often see people use. Okay, so here we're going to define the event listener function. Okay, so remember, this is a function, right? We see that skeleton, we see the function keyword, we've given it a name. We notice it takes this argument, it takes that event as an input, and then all of the code for that function goes inside of those curly braces. So then we can actually comment within this function too to explain what we're doing, right? So this line, we explain, this line is to prevent the browser from doing its default behavior of refreshing the page. So I'm going to say stop page from refreshing. Because that's really what we're doing, right? Core of it, we're telling the browser in the default way for that event. All right, so the next thing we're going to do in line 15 is what? Does anybody want to tell me what this line does? Line 15 now? Actually, let me make this font a little bit bigger. What are we doing here in line 15?
Good. It's finding the value of the entry.
Exactly. So we're going into our. Remember, when we read these assignment lines, right? We always start on the right-hand side and then work to the left. Right? So here we're going and finding this new entry element, whatever it is. In this case, it's an input we saw. We're finding this element, and then we're getting the value out of that element. Dot val input value. So we're going to grab that value, that string value, out of that input, and then we're going to assign it to this variable input. We're putting it in that variable so that we can use it at another point in our program, in fact, on the next line. Right? So first thing I'm going to say is get the user input from the form. Okay, what are we doing on the next line? What should I put in this comment? So what would be a good comment for this line? Anybody want to take a guess? Yeah.
We're changing the user input straight to float.
Exactly, right? But when we grab that user input out of the form, it's always going to, when we use this .val, grab some user input, we're always going to have a string. But we don't need a string here. We actually want a number, right? We want a float because that's most similar to currency. And so here, we're going to convert that user input to a float. And we're going to store the result of that conversion in this new variable, user input number, right? So convert user input to a number. Okay, and then this line, this is when it gets super interesting. What are we doing in this? Yeah.
You're changing user input and currency using the conversion function.
Exactly. We're just going to take this user input number and we're going to pass it in to this convert to currency function. And the result of that is going to be a formatted currency string, right? So we're going to take that number and we can convert it to a currency string that looks good that we can put it back into our HTML. So here we can say format the user input number as currency or something of that nature, right? Okay, so let's jump down then to this and talk about that for a second. Okay, so once again, this is a function, right? This is a function that's unlike this one, right? This function up here is what we call an event listener. Right? Its job is solely to respond to that submit event. This function here is not an event listener. It's a function that takes some input and returns some output, right? So in this case, this convert currency function that we defined takes a number or a num, this thing num, the argument num as input, and it does some stuff to it, we'll talk about, and then it returns some output, right? So we can see it's a sort of a different class function, right? You know, sort of taking input and returning output, whereas this one's job is just to respond to that user input and do something to HTML, okay? So we can kind of see the subtle differences there. Notice that this function doesn't return anything, right? It has nowhere to return it to. It's just responding to that event. Okay, so let's look at this. So I'm just going to put a comment here. Function that takes as input and returns that number format as currency. Something like that. And actually, you know, this is kind of long, so I'm going to break it up onto two. And Sublime should do that nicely for you, hopefully. All right, so here, the first thing I'm doing is I'm taking this number that was passed in, and I'm using this to-fixed thing that we talked about that you can do to numbers, and this just rounds it to this many decimal places, right? So to-fixed rounds, when we put 2 in here, rounds this number to 2 decimal places, right? We're going to store that rounded number in a new variable called rounded number. So in here, I'm just going to say round to 2. Okay. And what's happening here on line 30?
Concatenating the number that you just made with put a dollar sign in front of it.
Nice work. Concatenating. Right, it's concatenating this dollar sign with that number that we just rounded, right? And concatenating, remember, is just smushing 2 things together, okay? And what we said is, if you concatenate or switch together a string and a number, that number gets converted back to string, right? And so now this whole thing is going to be a string that has the dollar sign and then the rounded number after. Okay, so we're just going to add dollar sign in front of number, right? Something like that. And I'm using sort of just buttons. And then down here, I'm just returning the formatted currency. Okay, so admittedly, this is a bit overkill on comments, right? This on line 32, like that's pretty clear. I didn't need that comment probably to explain that line. But just as an illustration, I think it's useful to see like how writing English comments can sort of clarify what we're going to clarify to other people, but also it can help us think to ourselves what we're trying to achieve in this line. So even before I start writing this line, I can write this English, and I can say, well, here in this line, I'm trying to achieve, I want to add a dollar sign in front of that number, right? And then I can think about how I would go about doing that. So sometimes we write comments, oftentimes, in fact, we write comments before we even start writing the code that corresponds to it, as a way to start processing the problem that this line is to solve. Okay, so we have one more line that we've written so far, and that's this line 22. And here, I'll just go ahead and read this on myself. We're finding the element on the page with the ID of entries. In this case, it happens to be the body of a table, right? So that whole receipt is a table, and the body is where we're going to put the individual entries, and that happens to have an ID of entries. So we're taking that body of a table, and we are appending some HTML. So remember, this jQuery's append function will append HTML. So add one, and then another, and another, and another, whereas .html replaces the HTML on the side. So each time we do it, we replace, append keeps adding it. So you have like a list of things, which is what we want. And so adding some HTML, and in the middle of the HTML, we're putting that formatted currency that the user inputted. Okay. So that's what we've got so far. Does anybody want to guess what the next step might be? Well, what do we have left to do, in other words? So let's look at it again in the browser. Right, so we've got it so that it numbers, great, and it adds them to the entries, but there's still a piece missing here. Right, the total is saying 0, when we want that to be a running total of all of the entries, right? So that piece is left, we still need to do. So let's turn back to the code. I need to add a comment here, so I'll say add entry to the table body. Okay. All right. So then is add that entry to the total, right? So where are we keeping track of the total so far? Exactly. We're keeping track of the running total in this variable total. So it's going to start off as 0. Each time we add an entry, we want it to add to that total. Okay? We know we want to do something to this total variable. Well, we want to reassign its value to the total plus the new amount that was added. Okay? So what am I going to do after this plus sign? Yes, right? We have 3 options here. We could put the user input number, or the user input currency. Those are 3 things that we're keeping track of. The one we want here is the user input number. And why is that? Because what? Well, so, I mean, you know, we could also the one that we were looking for. Why do we need to put it instead of this? Yeah, and what do you mean by that?
It's in currency instead of just.
Right, so what is the type of this variable here? So is it a string or a boolean?
String.
Right. What is the type of this here? String number boolean. The third one is also a string, right? Because we added that $sign in front of it. We converted it back to a string. So this one and this one are strings. This middle one is a number. And numbers are the only data types that we can do something like addition with, right? And so we need this number variable because that's the only one that's going to allow us to do the sort of arithmetic we need to in order to calculate a total. So here we're going to say the total is now equal to the, oh man. I didn't even lose Wi-Fi this time. I don't know why it happened. It's coming. Okay, so we can say that the total is now equal, we're going to reassign it the value of the total plus the user input number. Okay, so we're just going to add this new entry to the running total and add it up. Now we learned there's another shorter way to write this same statement, right? And the shorter way is like this, plus equal. Right. So those 2 things are equivalent. This is just a shorter way of writing the same thing, right? So this means total is equal to total plus this thing, right? It's the same thing. And in fact, I can put a comment here to sort of illustrate that. Now one may ask, if I'm going to spend all that time writing out that comment, why write the shorthand version at all? And that would be a great question. But this is because this is sort of like our notes, right? In some ways. Okay, so we've incremented that total, right? We've added some more about the new entry to our total. We now have that total. Now what do we want to do with it? Exactly, right? So this total is a number, correct? But we want to put it back into the HTML, and we want it to look nice. So we also want to convert this to currency as well. And luckily, we have a function defined to do that for us, so we don't have to write all of these steps individually again. So we can say var total currency is equal to convert to currency total. Okay. So we're passing the total in as an input to this function, and it's going to return as output that total formatted as currency. And we're going to store that output into, let me put this higher up on the screen, can I? We're going to put that, the result of this, the formatted currency, into this variable total currency. Okay, so basically doing the same thing that we did up here, but this time we're using the total. Okay, so now that we have that, there's one more step, right? Anybody know what that step is?
We have to call the HTML, make the new total, what the total currency is.
Exactly. You just have to update the HTML so that it has this new currency in the HTML. So let's go in and look at the HTML. Well, you'll notice the place where that 0.00 currency is in a TH, which stands for table header. It's in an element that has an ID of total. So it's really easy for us to find using jQuery. And then we can modify that HTML to be the new total. Okay? So easy enough, pretty similar to what we did above. So we're going to find in the DOM, document auto model, on our page, we're going to find the element with the ID of total. And so up here, we use append. Is that what we want to use here? Do we want to use append to add some more HTML to it? Or do we want to use .html to replace what's inside of it? Which one do we want to use? Right, we want to replace. Yes, thank you. We want to replace what's in there, right? Because if we append it, right, it's going to say 0.00, and then right after that, it's going to say some other total, and then after that, it's going to say some other total, and after that, it'll say some other total, as long as we keep adding these entries, which is not what we want. We want it to change, basically. We want it to replace that text as the new total, right? So this is different from our entries, where we want to keep track of each one. We want to append each one and keep them in there. Here, we just want to replace it. So we're going to do .html and put our total currency. Okay, let's save this. And yeah, I'll give you a second to make sure you got that. Okay, and now let's just run this. So I'm going to add 90. So now what do you notice? We notice that 90 is here as an entry, but also our total has added that 90. So if I add another 90, my total's gone up to 180, and I have two 90s as entries. And now it seems to be behaving exactly like we want it to be. Cool. So one more thing that we might want to do, okay? And this is something that may or may not have come up in your homework as well. So you'll notice when I hit enter, right, that 90 is staying there, which is a nuisance more than anything. But you know, for our end user, we might want to like clear that out, right? So When I enter it, that input's been accepted, we've processed it. Well, now we should probably clear it out and allow the user to input something else. Well, there's a number of ways to do this, but I'm going to show you one way. So let's take a look at this line here. Okay. So this line here, or really just this part of this line, right? What is that line saying? That's saying find this element on the page with the ID new entry, right? And grab out the value, okay? Grab whatever user inputted value was in that thing and give it to me. And then, here we're assigning it to a variable. Now, this .val function has a dual nature, okay? So it can be used to do two different things. And you'll find this in a lot of jQuery functions. They have this dual nature, okay? So if we have it like this and we put nothing in the parentheses, that means get the value, okay? Does anybody see where I'm going with this? There's nothing in the parentheses, it means get the value. However, if I put something in the parentheses, it means set the value to something, okay? So what we can do is we can set the value of that input to be what we call an empty string, nothing, right? Okay, so let's see what that would look like. I'm gonna copy this part and I'm gonna do this at the very end of my function. So it's gonna be the last thing I do after I've processed everything else. So here, as written, this means get the value of this new entry element, right? That's what this line means. But if I pass something into these parentheses, for instance, if I passed this for whatever reason, this would set the value. And it would set the value to the string Jacob, which wouldn't make any sense in our application. But, for demonstration purposes, we could do this. This isn't exactly what we want, right? We want to empty it out. So in order to empty it out, we can just make this what we call an empty string, right? So it's a string with nothing in it. Yes?
Would it be possible to go maybe that's CSS, have like a placeholder?
You can have placeholders on inputs, but that's something that you do in the HTML. Yeah, you wouldn't have to do that in JavaScript. Okay, so why then do we not need a variable like we had above for this statement? Yeah?
Because you don't have to store anything, because you're not getting anything, you're changing.
Exactly, right? So in this line here, we're grabbing something, we're getting something out of the HTML. And so we need somewhere to put that. And that's where we put it in this variable. On this line 31 here at the bottom, we're not getting anything, we're setting something, right? We're modifying the value, we're setting the value. It's not going to give us anything back. And so we don't need a variable to store anything because there's nothing to store. Okay? So remember, this .val has a dual nature. Nothing in the parentheses means get. Something in the parentheses means set. Okay, let's just verify this works, and then I'll explain another time that we can see this in jQuery. Okay. Now when I enter 90, I notice after I hit enter, that thing is now empty again. And you see this how much? If you look at the HTML, you'll see that is a placeholder attribute on the input saying how much. So that can be done in HTML. Don't need JavaScript for that. Okay. So just as a quick aside, there are a lot of jQuery functions that have this sort of behavior, right? If you put something in it, it sets something, but if you don't put anything in it, it gets something. So another place we might see this is, say, the .css function. Okay. So far we've seen the .css function be used like this, right, where we pass in a property name, comma, a property value, right? And this, right, this sets the value white to the property color, right, on this element. If, for whatever reason, we left off this second thing and we just typed in color, this would get the CSS color, right? So here we're not specifying a value, and so this is going to get that value. We could store it in a variable if we wanted to. So, you know, that may or may not be useful in the programs we're writing, but it's just something to know that a lot of these jQuery functions have this sort of dual behavior. They behave in both ways. Any questions about this? And, you know, if you're ever unsure, the jQuery docs are pretty good. So, you know, get good at reading the jQuery documentation on, you know, jQuery.com, and you can sort of start to understand, you know, what that means in this context. But, you know, one of the more useful ones is the one we saw above, where we actually set the value. And we'll use that a lot to reset form. Okay. Cool. So any questions about all of this? All right. We're going to talk about one more small little thing that we missed last class, and then we'll do lab. All right, so the last thing that I want to talk about as far as function scale, because that was the last topic we covered, are these things called anonymous functions. So, you know, anonymous, anonymity, you know, means, you know, very literally having no name or something like that. Well, that's exactly what an anonymous function is. It's a function that we can create that has no name, right? And we've seen these, as a matter of fact. At one point, I showed an example like this, right? So here is what we've been doing most of the time, where we find an element on the page, right? Something with the ID my button. We listen for its click event, and when that happens, we run some function with the name change background. And then subsequently, we define that function by using this function keyword, giving it that name, and then defining its steps. Well, an anonymous function, we can remove that name piece, and we can put it directly in those parentheses like this. Okay. So this and this are equivalent. They're the exact same thing. This one is just using an anonymous function without a name. And why might this be okay in some situations and not others? Can anybody guess why we might use this in some situations and not others?
Maybe like you're only using this function this one time.
Exactly. So reflect with me, if you will, back to the last the cash register example we just did, right? Think about that add entry function and that convert to currency function. Which one of those might be a candidate for not being anonymous function, or both? Look at your code if you want. Which one of those might be a good candidate for being an anonymous function, and why? Would either? Would both? I'll show the code up here. So how many times in this program do we use the add entry function? So that's how many times it's called, but how many times do we write its name? Just once. How many times do we write the convert to currency function? Twice, right? once for the total and once for the entry. Right? So the convert to currency is definitely not a good candidate for being an anonymous function. In fact, it would be a very bad idea to make that an anonymous function because you have to write it twice. However, this add entry function, it's only ever used in that one place, right? It's only ever used to respond to that submit event. So it's a pretty good candidate for being an anonymous function. And often using jQuery, we'll see that anonymous function syntax for defining event listeners, right? It's more often using anonymous functions when you're looking at other people's code than not. They'll use anonymous functions. So let's go ahead and just convert this to using an anonymous function. So remember, all we really have to do is copy this entire function. I'm going to copy it without that first comment because that would get a little messy. I'm going to copy that entire function, and I'm just going to drop the whole thing in between these parentheses where the name used to be, right? So then the name is there currently, but now I'm just going to drop in the whole function. So I'm just going to Control V. And now that it's here, I am no longer referring to it anywhere, so I can just drop the name. Right? So this function is now anonymous. It has no name, but it doesn't really need it because we're not referring to it anywhere else in this program. Right? It's only in this one spot. And so, the reason we show you this is because this is the syntax that you'll mostly see when you're looking at, other people using jQuery, or if you're looking, Stack Overflow or something. Oftentimes, they're going to use this anonymous function syntax in order to define event listeners. And we can use it in other places potentially too, maybe some that we'll see down the road, but this is going to be the most common use here. Okay?
Can you redo that one more time?
Yep. So all I've done here is I started my cursor here at the very beginning of the function, and I went down here to the very end, right? So the very last one, I just Control X or Command X to just cut that whole thing. And I'm going to drop the entire function in between these parentheses where the name used to be. So this name, remember, is just referring to that function. So instead of putting its name, I'm just going to put the whole function and just paste that in there. And now, because it's here and I don't need to refer to it anywhere, I can drop the name entirely. It doesn't need a name. Yeah, just paste. Command V, Control V to paste it. Yeah, I'll just do it one more time. No, it's fine. I'm just highlighting this whole name, right? I'm just highlighting the whole name. I'm just dropping the entire function in between those two parentheses. So I'll do it in two steps. First thing, I'll get rid of the name. Second step, Control V, paste the entire function. And then I just drop the name. Okay? So to recap, anonymous functions, they're great because they save us some typing, right? They're a little more concise in some situations, especially and pretty much only in those situations where we're only referring to them once. But we can't ever use them again after that fact because we have no name to refer to them by. Okay. So something like convert to currency, where we're going to be using it multiple times in our program, or even a function that we think might be a good candidate for using more than once, right? If it's a function that takes some input and returns some output, it's probably a good candidate for having a name. It should have a name, probably. So there are pros and cons here, and you have to sometimes make decisions about whether or not a function should be anonymous. And for our purposes, the only time we'll really use them is for those event listeners. Yes?
So maybe like the way you did, like we wrote it out and then we went back and changed it to anonymous, maybe it would be better. If you give it a name, and then once you only use it once, then change it back.
Yeah, I mean, totally. That's probably a good approach in most situations. The only exception might be is if this function is an event listener, then probably it's only place that you're going to be using it is in response to that event. And in that case, you can probably write it as an anonymous function the first time. But yes, good point. Okay, any more questions about anonymous functions? Okay, so what we're going to be doing the rest of the class, really, is, oops, not that, is this, right? So we started this last Monday. So if you weren't here, what we're doing is have very loose requirements, right? This is all we have. There's no starter code, nothing. It's just these very loose requirements, and your task is to implement these requirements to the best of your abilities, right? So what we want to do is we want to have some form, like we've seen in the past couple of exercises, some form that accepts user input, degrees Celsius. So I can type in, 10, and that would mean 10 degrees Celsius. We want to take that input, we want to convert it to degrees Fahrenheit. That might be a good candidate for some sort of function, right? We want to convert it to degrees Fahrenheit. We want to then write that degrees Fahrenheit into the browser somewhere so somebody can see it. The user can see the result. And then, based on that temperature, we want to change the background color. So if it's a hot temperature, we want to change the background color to, say, a red. And if it's a cold temperature, we want to change it to, say, a blue or something like that. And you can even make some sort of gradient where if it's like in the middle, we change it to, whatever you want. You can make it as intense as you want. But these are the loose requirements, and it's your job to flesh these out, okay? So you're going to have to make all your folders, create your index.html, your index.js, make a style sheet, all of these things in order to make this happen. All right, so go ahead and get started. And, the question? Oh, okay, cool. And, we'll be walking around as you're working in case you get stuck. And if you're really rocking and for some reason you finish this early, we have some bonus assignments, bonus sort of loose requirement type things that you can work on next.
Is 212.
I feel like it would be more useful to have a Fahrenheit assessment.
No, this is America, so we need things in Fahrenheit. So it's useful to convert to.
We do something like this. You're right.
So just take a look at your sort of notation. So what? There you go.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure.
Of course. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, you got your usual what do you call order of operations in JavaScript? Have this, all that good stuff. You got that. Just slack that.
What's that?
Just slack that.
There it is. All these ads too. That's a key. Look, I did it.
Nice work, I
I added all these ads.
already monetized it. Well, that's great. It's very impressive.
Here has Google Ads on it.
Yeah.
It's making money.
You gotta wonder though, does that site really make money? Probably does.
It's a farmer's almanac.
Oh, yeah. But even if I
What,
miss
temperature conversion?
If those ads are showing, they're getting close.
Although how many times people actually check temperature for websites?
That's true. Google will do it for you.
Yeah, also, yeah, Google just does it for you.
Yeah.
In the like URL, you know.
Bing somehow gives a percentage of the search. It's like at least 8%.
It's pretty good. Like,
I'm always.
better than the Zoom, that's what I would say. One of my best friends with God works for Microsoft over in Redmond. I was getting crap for the Zoom's existence.
That was a pretty bad period for them. And while this is sort of like individual work, feel free to, lean on the people around you, ask questions, help your neighbors. That's how we work in the real world.
So before I had this, it was working. And I changed it to submit. And that's not.
Are we going to?
So maybe there's a mixture.
I mean, it's interesting. This. I haven't to put that in there.
Yeah, I mean, it's good. It's probably not like useful here, but it's useful as like overall debugging tool. But that's something like you forget about like type coercion and the way things are being stored. You don't know. Sometimes you think it's a string, it's a number.
Yeah. That's why I
Or
like
you
React.
think it's a number, it's a string.
Oh. Okay. You have your issue.
Well, no.
React to like CF component. So then you give
Ah,
types. And so
okay.
like what
Thank you.
type
One
of
thing.
you should have. And then it'll just like spit out answers in the console whenever you put in something that's not right. It's like, it just shows that you're sharing.
It's almost like it has conditionals built in. Say, like,
Yeah, I mean, it does, like
if-
somewhere with it.
Yeah. If
You
type
can
of-
be really specific, so you can do like, you can use like shape, you could say that it's shape, and because it's an object that has these keys with values of these types, like you can get this or something. It's pretty cool.
Okay.
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 I remember stores.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out how to conversion
Yeah,
sizes.
this is my, this I work on this one.
Okay.
So is that going?
Wait, what?
Because.
My company, we make those
Right.
sites.
You make those buttons?
Yeah.
They're great.
Yeah.
What is
They're all
delicious?
Well, not delicious. Oh, what is delicious? I don't
I
know.
always see that on there, like, you know, it's like, if they list like 40, that's like the 38th one. Like,
Yeah.
nobody uses that.
We probably have like hundreds of training services. It's like, I don't, most of them are like popular in other countries, but delicious, I don't know.
It's like CompuServe.
Okay,
I wish we had a CompuServe button, that'd be awesome.
That's a throwback right there. That was like the one when your AOL trial ran out. And you're like, oh, CompuServe trial. That's another free one.
Pretty sure AOL still has those tests. They still have
And actually, what you
like,
could
in
do,
the office. They just,
I mean, it's adding the ID to the form.
God, I remember like how bad was the internet, man? Like people like went on AOL.
Fair
And,
it's crazy.
ugh.
Yeah.
I'll get off
Do
the
you
phone.
have to change it to string to be able to display it in the
So, no, you don't have to, because it'll be, display constellation, it's going to be. So you don't have.
Should they do this?
However, if you want to put a little degrees,
You probably should have seen the temperature converter set. Yeah, exactly.
No, I think you have, so this, yeah,
So like, let's just say right now you type in something. So like you're gonna convert 20, so right now, right here, 20. So yeah, so remember that when you did the next, we set that up, right? That was something we went over. We did the dot val, you know, with the.
Yeah, you probably wanted to go like what we see so far, where it's
Right,
like.
you could set the value.
You don't have to
Keep it on there. And then what you do is you set the value of the second field to your converter. Right? So you can, absolutely. So it's really just, the only real, I think, is it really just, what you're saying is the right way of thinking about it is the two input fields? Yeah, so I think it's really just a stylistic choice, whether you're gonna put that in an input field or put it like in another part of your HTML, it's fine. Like it's more of a user experience thing at that point, where you would wanna have something that clearly said like, this is it, this is where you're actually typing it in, this is where the output is. That would be the reason I wouldn't use two input fields, but it's fine. Yeah, you just, you know,
So
grab the value and then you set the values.
Then you would want to use either one.
Arguably, this is.
Bonus, convert to kelvins.
Could be good.
Double bonus, drop down menu to pick the initial
Oh.
one, then spit all three out, or spit the other two out.
So.
And then go back and forth, so you can change this one. Now we're getting really.
Triple bonus, if if you have 32 Fahrenheit and you want to change it to Celsius, it automatically converts it if there's a value already in there without having to send it again.
Well, that's too much.
Yeah.
Pull it back.
Okay.
Rein yourself in. How's it going?
Unexpected cooking. So how this happened.
Okay.
So I know it's here, things that, and it's the season, is that there's one that's building.
No, I'm trying to figure out just like,
Without using.
So it should be.
Yeah, if the air is here, it's gotta be something before this. That's fine.
So
like people.
You can just open a form tag,
So look
add
at-
an input
look at this
field,
curly brace.
you know, type text, input field, and then
Where is the
submit,
open?
and then you're good to go.
So,
Or a button type submit, and you're good to go, and then you close the form. Yeah, so you really need like 3 elements. You have 2 elements.
one here.
And then really you want it out, you want it in line with this, so you can see.
You can just
You
have,
want it in line with where the.
you can have an input field, and you can just have like an anchor tag or a button tag, and you can tie your version of it to the that one.
So I would want to keep that function, whatever you got, whatever the thing has the ID of now. So whatever you're sending it to, that's the thing.
So how does this look? So basically, we have to basically, whatever input they have, rapid value is not going to see time. That's when you can see time, it was a great picture. Well, I guess.
You can start this way, you can always change it. Maybe, yeah.
Just in your dictionary.
Okay. Okay, cool, so we're doing pretty good. Obviously, you have some steps left. I'm not responding to any user.
Kind of wondering what's going on with the .css.
So, one of the things I would say is.
So for .css, so Jake was mentioning earlier the difference between getting and sending. So .css, you pass in one argument as an getter.
The other thing I would,
And it
okay,
gets
line 13,
CSS value for that.
I would take that.
But that
First
first
argument
argument
is
is always
always
actually.
inside, and I would try to make that.
So it's not a function, it's not like a.
A reusable function that takes inside.
Okay, yes.
And then with 2 arguments, it's a set function.
Okay.
Just to show sets those.
And a lot of, I think a lot of
Like
things.
one line, it's not necessary.
I can't think of
You know,
that,
you can imagine that's something we might want to do.
or like anything with,
Just to
like, dot vowels, that's 0 arguments, right?
That's
I think so.
Yeah.
A getter with 1 argument.
Catch my other text.
Where? I didn't have enough time to read it all, so I'll just say we have, but.
Another thing,
Also,
one function that we just renamed.
Yeah.
That one, you know, what's its job? Its job is to respond to some.
That's true.
So it could potentially.
You don't need to spell
not-
it.
right, that's
If
like.
everything is misspelled consistently,
Okay.
like variable names, then you don't have to spell it.
Just something you should want.
Yeah.
We don't use that until we.
Spelling correctly?
I said as long as you misspell all your variables together.
Yeah. Yeah, right. If you can't remember.
Like if your function name has a typo and then you call it with that same typo, you're good to go.
Yeah.
Oh, no, sorry, it's not a function.
Oh, I have to define.
Nice.
That's just.
I mean, it looks good though. It's after that.
So now you run it. It's great.
Need help? Okay.
So keep in mind, this race here, I have not.
Well, okay, so whatever forms have. Forms are really good for receiving.
Yeah, just watch out for like buttons on it. You don't really have to set like your square.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Like convert, yeah, you can
Yeah.
Yeah, you're definitely.
You know, we roll these inputs up here. So that's it. It does, but that implies that we're gonna allow the user to edit
Or whichever direction.
But really what we're going to do, we just start converting one way. We're not gonna let them convert back. So here, if we have this as an input, the user's gonna.
Well, I mean, like, it's implied. So, it's basically, there's some.
Well, remember, this is just a div, right? We can use text and name. Like if it is.
I think this is really good.
Okay. How do I?
But how do you get?
Oh, so what,
So those are like built-in jobs.
Is that a game? Oh, and then.
so, I think what it's looking at with that function is that you're passing an argument. So look at what you're passing to that function.
Yes, you're getting it.
Okay.
So, or not passing it, so you're declaring a function that num is the name of the argument. So num should be the name of the variable you use in the function. Well, that would take the arguments and now,
Is it not working?
like, so you basically, you want to convert to Fahrenheit, you probably want to put in like Celsius there, right? Yeah. And then it would change, so now whenever you call that function, whatever argument you put in there.
Yeah.
So if you change user input number to Celsius, now whatever argument you put in there is going to be plugged in. If you did like convert to Fahrenheit 2, it would be like 2 times 1.8 plus 2. But now, so what you've done is you say, my name's Tim, you're declaring this variable, which is converting this argument input.
I parsed it and then I want to.
So you've got this argument, you put in line 17, put in this
Can I
argument,
actually-
it's converting it here, but you're not returning that same variable, you're returning that variable.
And what are trans-
So.
So you want to return user input Fahrenheit.
So
Right.
token.
The point of the function is to convert and then return.
Unexpected.
Right. So that's what we had before with, what was it, currency convert?
That's why I was-
You're trying to define the function in the first half. The second half was more like.
So now-
It's not a
So
problem.
remember different uses like you.
No, because what'll happen is, so that function, so it really doesn't matter what you call that argument, as long as what it's called within the
That's
function is the same.
interesting.
You call it whatever you
The
want.
car, this.
So
this, that's.
now you've got
So you're kind of hybrid.
user number. So you've got here, parse it and turn it into a
Okay, that
number.
makes sense, yeah.
So
Now you parse it what it is and turn it into
Decimal number. I sort of figured this is a big name and you that function.
and then,
Call.
and then what you'll do is you're calling the function here with that user input number. That takes the place of Celsius here and it returns it back and
But
sets
can we
it
make it a
to
variable
user
instead
input.
of this kind of thing?
You probably want to,
Yes, you can, you could just change the bar.
But now instead of
I'll
calling
do
it
that, that sounds easier.
It is, easy. So
What is-
that
yeah,
work,
what
that
is-
you would think, converting to
let's give
temperature
that a shot.
from Celsius to Fahrenheit is a good candidate for like a little function that just has that one little value.
Okay, so it would be like function.
Yeah, so really like, don't get too hung up on the names of your arguments, it's more of a readability thing, but just within the function, it has to be the same name, otherwise the function,
But this is a
Plus,
function
it
that
goes,
just has the
I
job
don't know,
of
right, that's how the function knows where you want
It's very analogous to in the last exercise, to convert the currency
Right, the bottom one, okay.
So,
Switch
you
to
can use that as a track.
that. Thank you.
Yeah.
You need to make sure I did this right. Have like Does that look right?
So right now, yes.
So just try to write it.
So, yes.
You okay?
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
So, right. You know,
Nowhere?
it's very, very.
All right.
So there'd be a semicolon?
Okay, so you can do that, so you totally work without it. That's everything.
Okay, everything is.
Yeah.
So one thing, so except for this very rare case where we have the documents now, which is something we call everywhere else in the January first minute, it's got to be no.
Even anything like that.
Even with that, you know, every CSS
That's back to itself.
the only reason the document isn't to advertise there, it's not like it's actually a variable standards. So that's why it's different.
Okay, what I would suggest is highlight on between times 3 and 3. Because of that, if you got.
Yeah, I want to see.
Well, because I already have my variable.
Super sweet. That's awesome. Okay. Let's see, I haven't written down the side.
Great.
Well, your function. It has to be.
Isn't it ever
So here's
It's not because inside of that function.
this, I think I know this earlier.
So walk me through this thing. So.
So what you're doing on line 6 is grabbing this value and put it in and putting.
No.
Oh, yeah.
So you don't actually have a form. That's your first. Right. So you're looking for a submission. Or a submit event. That event handler listens for a submission of the form itself. Right? Yeah. So you want to put that. You want to put that within a form.
Okay. This is taking it off.
And you would want to actually.
So this is a game.
link that handler
So you have to match
the selector for the form itself.
So,
Not the form. So if you want to do an ID
entire A
form.
choose it down
Right.
and then clear each out.
So give that a shot. What I was getting at, what I was getting at is basically, here, so tab user input will be a string. That's not gonna, that's a little JavaScript test that's happening around data.
Would I use another?
Any questions about this?
No, so I like to make it.
Even if you write the number 5, it stores it as a string equals 5, you know, you parse it and turn it back into a.
Yeah, you can just make it exactly like this. If you want to like style a little bit, by all means, but really.
And type up, yeah.
More just.
You don't really need that now, it's just loaded with that, that does JavaScript.
Okay, so all the spaces that you've selected already, what is going to be used for?
If I take 47.
Yes. How you do that is, there's probably lots of different ways. Yeah, I mean, so, it's been about time for a break. We're not gonna do like a formal break since it's all loud, but feel free to get up and go and come as you please, for the rest of the class. So, not gonna be offended by that. Yeah.
So. Probably looking for my
Okay, so here's the interesting stuff. So the submit only happens on a form.
So then open the page.
So the issue here is that we have that form.
Right. So
You could do that, yeah, totally, you can totally do that.
Yeah.
There's not,
What I was getting at there is you more so want to tie your JavaScript.
well, you just change this div to be a form.
Put something in it. Okay.
And, if you do that, then you need to put the button
So
inside.
that, when you're thinking of like, oh, I want to send this.
But either of those things work, probably just put that.
Yeah, so.
Semantically, this thing is really form, except for instances are important. And generally, when we see the input,
What is
the
it?
input element, we normally see that in a form. We expect it to be inside of a form. So a button tag by itself, it generally means a button that's not okay, so that can have buttons on a page that aren't necessarily tagged.
Alright.
So when we're using something inside of a form, what we want to do is use another input that has a type submit.
Like basically, positive.
Using two cursors.
Now,
Submit.
Yeah, and it always has to
before
go.
you get to that, what is the
Quotes, yeah. Just like that. And really, just to be very explicit, the input above it should have a type text. So
There's a difference.
There's all kinds of different inputs.
Let's say line eight, you
It
said
happens that
R,
it happens to be that the default one is text, but
you know,
it's
the
better
value
to
in that
use
section.
text.
Okay. And then what if you do like at the end, is you do the conversion, you say like B is equal to
That is a
100.
submit button.
Is that actually?
It doesn't actually take
field.
text inside of it like this. It, much like this, has a value, and its value is gonna be what's
No.
displayed on the button.
Right, because you're grabbing, like in line eight, you're grabbing the value of that empty input field and setting it, and now it's B. But you still have to access the site, so that line is actually not useful at that junction.
Yep, and you don't need to close time because an input.
Like in order to set that variable in, you're still gonna need that
You want
select
that
and that
term self-closing?
Yeah.
It just means it doesn't need closing time.
So really, you wanna say
If I were to do that, it would just display like.
Since the person clicks, what is this value, right? And then what I would do, just go below that, like.
I mean, it's still gonna work, but,
It's
you
just
don't.
unnecessary. Okay.
What I would do is write console.log, and then if I was
Yeah, it totally should work, because we're listening for submit of it on.
save it,
Now, as of one,
yeah,
the number you want.
save it, reload your page,
Values.
open your, dev tools in
So I
Chrome,
don't know what.
and type
So
something, like, type into.
Well, let's just take a moment and say, hey, we did something right.
Right.
Can you
So now it's not
describe,
displaying.
like, the stairs? Yeah, it can't find your JavaScript, so it's not really.
So look at line 3, and then look at line 20.
Where's your next one?
So this should be.
Well, if it's in the same folder, you don't need
No,
JS.
there's just a small syntax.
So if index
difference.
is in the JS folder, you can just do index.
So line 3, we know it's behaving like it should, right? But line
And for your
20,
CSS, you would actually do
what are you doing in line 3?
dot slash CSS. You need to jump back up to the weather folder. And then go back in. No, so.
Yep.
So
Because
for
it's an ID.
right now,
So why?
you're index HTML, you need to get back up to the weather
Is this-
folder. So you're gonna go to the beginning before CSS.
Yeah, well,
Do dot
that's,
dot.
Is that just?
it's just a Sublime thing, because Sublime knows the word submit
before.
It doesn't
I
know
see.
every
Sorry, go back. Yeah, it's the, okay. So you got that.
It's gonna know some,
And it's-
and the asbestos levels.
So that's-
Boom.
All right,
So then
awesome.
you might wanna format that, have like a degree sign.
So
Okay,
like,
awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
You got unexpected. That's not gonna run anything. So you got typo 14. Oh, that's all right. Just you can highlight the comment that for now.
Any questions?
Nope, just sit down.
You can actually here, I'll show you, backspace with and just highlight line 15 and just yeah, so it's command slash.
Oh,
And then that'll comment on anything you've highlighted.
Oh, so mine.
No, that's fine. So, yeah, just make sure you have it on highlighted. So it's gonna save this now. Go back. Develop left hand side, slash that. Hashtag this. Yeah, 7 equals false. That's not. You're trying to set a number. You don't actually need. You don't actually need lines 23 or 26.
This is pretty,
Yeah. Right.
Okay, yeah.
So,
let's say,
That's safe, that's right.
something this function and not necessarily remember.
Close.
It's
Line that's on.
so just looking at give that input. So this first question is going to ask is it even meeting my? And also this is not pure. I expect to when I use it, it should jump. Well, not just that, they're actually modifying. So easiest way to build. We want this to
Just check them, it's closed there, it's closed there, this looks fine.
You can see that
This, I think, that, so you didn't need that parentheses, because it was just closing a function declaration. Rather than, so the event handler one like event handlers take curly and parentheses, but the functions accept the curly. Yeah.
So
Now just type in like F5.
yes.
There you go. So you're running something. Yeah. Like the first pass is just to make sure that your event handler is running and you're grabbing the correct value. Those two things are checked on all the possible, right? So you've got that happening. So now you've got a value that you can convert and spit back out. Right? Go for it. And also to note here, whenever you call this function, make sure it knows what it's doing, right? Make sure it knows what it's evaluating by passing it in as an argument. So like you're probably going to call switch background here, but it will be an argument because it will have to evaluate that.
right, yeah, you actually need to like run the code. So in this case, like the way this.
How's it going up here, guys? You can.
So.
Is this right?
Is it?
This is like pretty like janky looking site, but it says like degrees equal.
Yeah, look up, Google this HTML entity degree sign. Degree, just like degree sign. Yeah, they're called. Yeah, so that's what it is. So go back, go back to your code. Yeah. Oh, it thinks that's so that itself.
That's fine.
And then yeah, so you need close there. That's why. Okay. Voila.
So now, yeah, it has a little explain yet, so that's why it's not fine. Next one.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. Cool. Thank you. How's it going?
Now both of these. User input and user
So just using this bridge and changing it around and,
Okay. Are you getting anything like happening on your page or anything in your JavaScript so far?
So that's kind of like.
What I would say to start is to just have an input field, have an event like click, and then get like console.log your values. Start from there, right? So that you're letting the user type some number in, and then there's the event, the submission, and then you're gonna grab that value and log it in your console. Like that would be a good first place to start. So make sure my event handler is working, getting the value, now you can use it.
But it could be.
Done? No. Okay.
Okay,
So something's horribly wrong. That's just asking. What part is wrong? Is that right? Yeah, you probably don't probably want to call it var. Yeah, that was, yeah. And then, right, what do you want to return there?
problem, I guess, I'm just gonna
Like, what's your last, like, pretty much what's your last variable? Just for, not whatever you want. Because it's just gonna be. So when you're returning a variable, it has to be like a variable that, like your JavaScript knows and you declare, right? Set. So what I'm saying is right before that, what was the last variable you just set? Just like right now. This one. Yes, right, that's it. Okay. How's it going?
So
Background cold. If that wasn't valid in CSS color property, I'd like to know what that was. Use some better colors though on the canvas. Get some
I mean, it's not the greatest.
get some cool ones. Get like this. Yeah.
So.
You probably want to just run that. You probably want to red.
Let's look back at this.
So your first problem is that where is change red a big call? No, that's never gonna run. You probably can just run that in one function. Like most, like so those conditionals. Yeah, exactly, right.
Input is submitted, but it's going to, these things have like two distinct uses.
And then the last thing is I think you want to pass like actual temperature as an argument. You can say change background and then in parentheses put temperature. And then change, yeah, exactly.
So those two things that are.
And then you actually, so what was the last step? My first question. Yes, let's put in your backend.
So reading the value.
Like on the next line.
So
Well, I mean, yes, but
So you switch that.
well, so now you're calling it without the argument that means, right? Because remember when you declared the function, you're saying
So-
one argument, so what is your
One
argument?
thing has to change, that's the tree, which is either line
So this is a for num.
Because it's evaluating the Fahrenheit temperature, right?
Right.
So within your function, right? So this is sort of the thing called scope, or like when you're within that function, where's the variable within your function that is when you need this temperature, right? So here, where's the Fahrenheit value? Like what did you call it? No, so actually within the parentheses. So what that'll tell you is that when JavaScript goes to that function, temperature, wherever temperature exists in that declaration will be user input Fahrenheit within your event.
Get it now.
Just got a little syntax there. So I would use the last
what you can do is.
as a reference.
So might be just like I was a very high temperature, like I was in trouble, like I was assuming like I wasn't ready. 900, I know a lot.
Yes.
It's gonna take.
So how many more
If you wanted to set to the next one, and
I throw in maybe a degree symbol next to it, why not?
and this will just set it as an yeah, so that way you can. Cool.
Because I think what I did was I did that.
You also misspelled Fahrenheit.
I parsed it and right.
Just FYI. No, it's FAH.
No, there is an H, so it's okay, I know it's a typo.
Okay, so.
But as I was saying earlier,
wrong.
as long as it's misspelled everywhere, it's
There's so much of that.
So when is line?
yeah, remember you can use Command E to come out at all.
After it's adding,
So where are you at right now?
So that may be a intuitive thing to think, but actually that's not correct. It's going to be run after the add entry function is defined, which happens as soon as the document is ready. So you see, when the document is ready, right, it's going to run.
Get it?
93.
So
The same line
to submit,
find this
to run this function,
then you run line 10
grab user input and you convert it to a number.
and 16.
So now you've got your number that's
As soon as the document's ready.
What you're gonna do
Only two lines
is
are going to
call this function
the form is
right,
submitted.
or
You
so
can
you
decide
HTML, right?
So
So right here,
system,
this all looks good.
only two lines
The scope of this function, the number that you want is user
when
input.
the
That's the Fahrenheit, or not, Celsius number that you have.
It's usually how it works. You just say it out loud to get it.
Yeah.
as part of the
So now you
event,
have your
you're
function that
inside
The num is the name of the argument, right? Does it go to any? It's actually within. Okay, so look at within.
As a matter of format,
Go back to 24.
generally what that's
Num.
to be indented at one level.
Do you see why that is? Because in the declaration of the function, num is what you want to do. But then we call it user.
And that helps us visualize the function. So now what's going to happen?
And also you need to add, you also need to add.
It's going to run line 5 and find this function, and then it's not doing anything then until the form is submitted. When the form is submitted, then it's going to run this down.
So you see that? So like here, user input is that, but then here, num takes that, like. Yeah. That way you can like, if hypothetically you're now saying to use that function, convert to Fahrenheit, anything, right? And then whatever was in that parentheses would take the place of num in our function. So now, you don't really want to write into the function because the function itself is just converting, so I would just return FAH. Right, so just return that. And
Okay,
now-
so a couple of things going on.
And
The
now,
first thing is
that number should
that
number should
So you
get.
know, after click event, all event, the
It's not
submit
going back
event is
into
unique in that
and so
submit event,
you have to
only have that on a form element.
Now he's gonna append it back.
So the form element is the only thing that can be submitted.
Okay.
And so here we don't have any forms. And so the submit event is not actually.
It can be any HTML.
So generally when we see an input
That's your body.
element, input elements are generally found inside of forms.
Not a pen.
Okay.
So perhaps.
Parentheses.
So that's where it's.
You actually want to do like.
So they're
Try that.
referring to
Say like
form.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Okay.
Another thing is if we go back to HTML,
Yay!
the buttons, typically is used for buttons that are not inside of users. It's really just sort of a disembodied button that has all the same job. When you use something inside of it,
Yeah, and then you wouldn't actually need a pen, because a pen actually adds HTML. So what you could do is
But it's an
type
input that has a type
HTML, right? Like, so you can like that HTML, FA.
underneath of the Celsius, make another input. Inside the form, so indented stuff. That's the one I'm trying to compute. Okay, and here type. So we're adding a type attribute, and the value there should be 6. And then, so what's this saying? There's all kinds of different forms. There's a text input, which is what this one is. So you haven't put a type text, but you can check there's also like radio buttons, there's also like selects, there's drop downs, there's all kinds of inputs. So one type of input is a submission.
Because it's,
And for a submission
it's a
button,
return
you give it
far
a value.
here, but it's actually user interface when you set it to, right? Instead
It's
of
actually
So in this, so FAHR is the number that gets spit out by that function,
and
but then you
whatever you
actually
put
set
here
it
is what's going to display on the button.
so you actually
So
set
here we might want to like convert.
yeah, it's within the scope of your
And then
This is not a class, not ready to give value, it's value. Period, not a hash.
well, we're not going to select.
Oh, we're not, okay.
We don't need to because remember the submit event is going to happen on the form even when we press this button.
it's
then you
returning the value, it's not
And
set.
actually, an input like this.
And so you can actually,
Closing tab.
what you could do is just you can do, actually need that.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're done.
Yes.
So you get rid of that.
Oh.
And actually, you can capitalize this convert, it really doesn't matter.
Stickler.
It's just what it's supposed
So try that.
Okay, so now let's take a look at the. Okay, so we're mostly good. Now the last thing is,
Yeah,
where
just
display,
space that.
it looks like you're trying to display
Well,
the result.
So just for you, right?
The thing,
Really, what the problem
whatever
is
you
just
call
put it in
this,
another.
right, for your function argument, all that really matters
So that
within
it's
the function.
not
itself.
necessarily an input, but just
All
like,
the functions
say,
goes
span or
to
div or
that
something
num
on the page where you can display.
And
it.
here, that really matters because it's like something that had to exist
Exactly.
prior to it, you know, if it's a
Yeah,
variable,
and then I think it'd be on the.
user scope that's right above it, you know.
it's just,
So
Yes.
you pass that in, it returns the value.
Yeah.
And then set it on the same line.
We're
Or
working
to the same
I
line.
thought for a second, like maybe.
So, a lot of sort of things with variables and scope, that's but
I'm not even worried about that.
no problem.
But, so, I want to get rid of this line, but I don't know what to put in it. How to get rid of it without breaking it. Because it didn't work right for that, and it gave me a decimal.
So 35 minutes,
So
and ignore you. Sometimes it never ends, right? So you have to stop.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Did anybody get Kelvin's score?
And I just want to slap the.
Not even attempted that.
Okay.
Absolute zero.
Let's get rid of my links here.
I did like put like a medium temperature.
Oh, sweet, a little casual, is there a little casual?
What is
It's,
Okay, so I can't send input, we're not just trying to use your MC.
it's a variable that.
Here, basically.
Variable like
Yeah, so that's the difference, so you, like, it is a number, but it's data type, yeah,
So you're gonna turn that into
data type number, yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yes, well, it's not racist, it's similar to a variable. It's like a variable that we don't have to explicitly pass.
But how does?
That's the input to the function. So
Okay.
instead
So
of
here, it's when you put in an argument, so you probably want to
It's
actually,
one.
what you want to do is use the argument within the function.
No, because it's a name.
So just write num, just write num, you don't actually, just write num. And and all I'm gonna do is write, delete lines, everything below function.
I wanted to make sure that.
So I want you to delete these 6 lines. Yeah. So I just write this, return num times 1.8.
And I can worry about that.
Yeah, there's actually
Plus
two ways you can write and jQuery stuff. There's
So, and then,
where you could
start a line and close that,
You got it, powerful.
and then, start a line again,
or you can do
and give me a curly bracket and a parentheses. Close your document. So, close curly bracket, and parentheses.
click.
Sorry, usually, shows.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I'm gonna.
Yeah, so now your document already
Make it the last.
so, so what I'm saying, so let's take a look here. Is this part making?
Yes.
So no matter what number you put, we're saying no matter what number you put in there, it's gonna be 1.8 plus 32 and then spit it out, right? So as long as those two things are named the same, that's fine. You can call it whatever you want, you know. As long as those num and num match up, right? Because that's the argument from passing into the function, doing something to it, and then returning it back out to the JavaScript. So now you're running that function here, like user put Fahrenheit, and now you can, you want to just put that back into the HTML.
So notice how it says 33.875.
But I didn't use.
Yeah, I mean,
I guess
that's from something else.
Yeah.
That's from something else.
So long as it's not the first one.
Okay, so that one.
Well, yeah, you still haven't put it back in the HTML yet, but you do have that variable, which is that converted number. So now you just want to put it somewhere in your HTML.
Yeah.
Right, because right now it only exists in your JavaScript, so if you use it, they're like, that doesn't really help. Yeah. You also probably don't need var total equals 0 otherwise 4. You don't have a running total.
So you do it a couple ways. So what do you do?
I wouldn't recommend starting. Yeah, don't. Just no. It's the issue is that it's not ever going to be how you're actually coding anything. You're never going to be like, hey, I need to like use this old thing that is just JavaScript and otherwise has bugs.
This shoe variable.
So,
So this same
Oh, you
situation.
did.
You don't need this, right?
Are you converting from so?
yeah, you just have to make sure you delete its corresponding closing tag. So,
Going.
yeah, right.
So try and add it to getting when it's displaced.
Yeah, what I would do is like find a place to put that in your HTML or like make a new element for it, and then just like use .html and that variable user Fahrenheit just to put it in.
Whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
So and also make sure your function is being called correctly when you hit .submit, because right now it isn't. That's an anonymous function, so you actually want to use add entries or rename that to something that.
Yeah. Actually run this line yet.
No, so that's not, so that event was fine. Because add entry being called, you get .submit.
Oof.
So.
No, right, because add entry is not written.
When the multiplication is
That, yeah, that's what I was getting at, right?
Well, those got quotes around it.
Calling the.
How's everyone doing here?
Like figuring out what it's checking. Right.
Yeah.
Right, does Fahrenheit have an H before the R does, right? Yeah, because I've seen other people.
Does it have an H before that?
FAHREN. Grid height.
Is it really?
I'm pretty sure.
Grid height.
I mean, that's how Jacob spelled it.
I mean, we've got to be.
And he's the teacher. He would not teach you something else.
It is, yeah.
Contractually, you can't.
Yeah.
I don't wanna change
I'm not
it.
fixing it.
No, so as long as you keep it misspelled consistently,
Yeah.
What is best practice?
best practice, misspelled consistently.
Misspell it.
No, she admitted the first age in Fahrenheit, I was like, as long as it's misspelled everywhere,
Yeah.
you're fine.
So
It's gonna be the.
I had to take 3 steps.
So why don't you guys?
It's
It's one of the
like
hard words.
HEIT, like what other words are you like, oh, that's how you spell height.
I'm good, I'm just helping out Jess.
Oh, cool.
She
Except is your variable.
so this is what she has, I told her that they call this off because her phone.
What is your forte?
But,
Nope.
why would she use it?
Just variables, there's no strings or hooks or anything.
Right, so.
Okay, so now this will take you 20 hooks, remember, this is to,
Remember, there's two functions we want to modify.
always read it, always read.
One is HTML and one is a pin.
This thing on the right
A
hand
pin
side.
does this, it adds one functionality with what we have to use.
Uh,
Not exactly what we want. So
Right.
use the program.
So she wants to use HTML. Okay.
And then it puts that value.
Right.
So
What's
now
up?
your number.
What is-
Now.
This is
we
my
can
math,
do
this isn't
math.
working. Still not working.
Let me see.
Math can have it in here. So in order to.
I did do it.
Yes.
So what you
Right, now it doesn't work at all. It worked before.
is.
What did you type in before?
I typed in 0, you just straight go back to 0.
It's gonna end up being the result of whatever.
Oh, because I changed it.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of
The,
referencing it
command
rather
command
than starting.
Or in your case,
Oh.
So, user now.
or something.
There's something.
I don't use it.
How long have you been, how long have
You
you
need to.
Oof, it's gonna be 5 years in August.
been, so before that, you were always.
Yeah.
How would
When
you
is
do that?
I'm just curious.
Just,
I mean, it doesn't really super matter like what
To
this
me,
looks
it's-
like, so.
I just think it's funny,
In general,
because
like,
we did all this time,
probably,
like,
yeah.
no, it's like,
So we're.
Oh, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's all the 90s.
yeah.
Yeah.
I just like Monday I come around, like,
Yeah, it's,
How do you call it that?
it's interesting, like those, command line tools.
Everything you have
on
so far
that,
is-
they should be draw for people.
Or they have one thing I will
They
say.
do a lot of stuff on the command line with like GitHub, with control.
This
Like, I never use
function
it.
name, no.
None of them, like, they don't.
I would change that.
What you'll just have is you'll have repos that have like remote repositories.
So.
And then
Oh,
also,
sweet, that's perfect.
So.
That's great.
No, so all you need to do is mess with your font, you probably need a 2 fix, right?
Yeah, I need to.
I don't know what you did with that font, that's something happening, but
I did.
you need to deal with that.
So what is like
For the view, vision
The
challenge
other thing is, you
user,
don't need this event.
what is
When you are attaching the,
what is the thing that stores your?
you just
Wait,
need
what?
its name. That's all you need, is that you do the user. Exactly.
Cool,
So
Turning the
what
font
you do
very
here,
nice.
right, is
I
you.
was gonna say, man, 'cause that is not right, but not,
You just stop
no,
there.
it is right,
Okay.
the reverse would not have been right.
That just.
So, this all looks good. Now, the last thing we need to do, right, is now that you have this value as Fahrenheit.
You realize your placeholder still says temperature Celsius.
Right.
Okay, so you need to find.
Oh, that's because
That's, you confuse me as a user, I don't know what's going on here.
I gotta
You find that.
I was thinking about going, doing the other way.
And then you need to set it to.
Let's go.
I'm wondering if I wanted to put it in.
And look how we found.
Oh,
Something to outbreak.
tables, yeah, this thing.
Look at
Or I
line
could just like, I guess, read
The
that.
very first part of this line, all we're doing is finding the element ID of this. So that's also the source of the we need to see elements with results and results. So it's gonna look very similar to the beginning of line 6.
So let's figure out how we do it.
Yeah, you could.
So the first thing is, you're passing it.
So that's.
So you want like a table with like, so it'd be like one column and Celsius.
Instead of teaching you out.
Yeah, that's kind of has to be a quick field, doesn't it? But you can style it.
As long as I don't.
You can style it quick fields. You can put padding around it. You can just, I would just like mess with input field, just CSS.
Terrible form.
So we've learned about a bunch of jQuery things. One is dot now, one is dot six, one is dot in, one is dot so that dot HTML.
First of all,
That says it's
yes,
changed
so
by
I-
None is equal to.
Orange, red, that's not even a real question.
So,
In
so
oral,
notice,
no, in oral.
this is kind of like.
I
would usually write
Oh my god.
the.
So, my childhood nickname is Trump.
So it's saying it's
We converted it, this number into Fahrenheit, stored in this variable, and that's what they're.
Is the operator.
So, let me ask you this, where is that condition
So that's
being
the first
evaluated?
verse, so let's see, let's see if
Like
this
when?
works.
Like, according to what event?
Now what's gonna happen is, we're gonna take polls this function.
So let's say,
Oh, wait,
actually run, it is.
Okay.
By time we create entry at 30.
Yeah, okay, awesome. Well, that's so surprising. Well, I get less surprising.
I honestly have no idea what that is. I think that's probably like,
So you got this B, you got this B.
so there,
Well,
the
yeah, I mean,
issue
so
is.
we learned the way, in the last exercise of how to clear that and reset that field, so you can look back there and see how.
The issue with line 25, is that tied to a function?
Whenever you declare a variable.
Like, is that within a function?
Well, we have one more step.
It is, you actually see when it's going to be run, so you will look at your page.
That's what declared.
It's going to be run when the document's ready.
Whenever you declare a variable.
Because the document's ready, it goes through all this.
Right here, for
So
example.
JavaScript gets to an event handler, and it's like, it doesn't run anything within that, because it's waiting.
So I can have
25, now it's, we're asking value, JavaScript will evaluate this variable which doesn't exist.
We need to find out.
So what you can actually do is put that word in a function. So yeah, actually, just leaving it there, where you had before, but just wrap a function around it, and then have an argument for that function be user
Come back to here.
Well, no, it's still gonna be hard here, that's right, we want to have to every time we have to submit it, somehow we want to be making this decision.
Exactly. So the way.
yeah, well, you give it a name, though. Give the function a
We
name.
have some options. Look at the three variables that we have.
Change that to and then user F.
Yeah.
So now F is gonna get returned back, so whatever that number is, now becomes what this whole thing is evaluated to.
And now call that within your event handler, and pass in the Fahrenheit number.
So now that we've
So
got
that you can like call that within your
new
How do we start it?
Okay.
Now what you can do is actually get it back onto the interface.
Well, say it out loud. What are we trying to do?
So call it like, so change color.
Yeah, so you've got.
And then pass in, instead of user F, pass in one of the actual numbers somewhere that you need here. I guess user F.
And then you integrate this here, so that's a parentheses.
Basically, the way that code works is you
If this space.
now jumps to.
But still work without the space because that's what you assigned it to.
Which means it jumps to here, brings this.
So go back, so the difference now,
The
the
whole
whole put
condition
those
has to be
things, just in your JavaScript, it runs through, right? Only when you place it in function declarations that are called.
And now it's right back to.
And now you're basically controlling when those events are right, or when those, like when those conditions are being evaluated, which will now be you want to see that handler on my, you know, what's it, 7.
Yeah. Yeah, so yes, then is the right thing semantic ones. So how we say them is just using code. We need to open in.
Style.
Yes, that one was
You have a conditional, it's like if the number is too low, like that's not even useful. Like, why are you asking? Yeah. Where do you go? How do you set that?
So you don't need them because basically what this means is if the thing in these parentheses is true, run whatever code comes in between these two. So basically then is the close. So now what do we want to do? So if this is like something like that, but in this case, we're doing the pivot fields. So you don't write, we want to find some element, what element is a set of values. So what do we want to choose after A is the same type of input. So we read the values. Very similar. And anytime we're putting something in, and again, these things need to be certain.
I'm thinking about just slapping it in this input.
Just
stick it in because
There's what we're doing here is CSS is a function that we're calling.
because it's
Okay,
it's me, it's
the name of the topic and the value here. And so we're basically passing arguments to the function that's using passing.
This way I guess we can call it variable.
Yeah, I mean, you're pretty close. So, so
what I'm thinking about doing is just do the CSS trick.
The first thing is this: what CSS properties do we use for the backwards?
So I might just do like functions. This just first background CSS.
And we then use
What you do is declare that function elsewhere, and then just call it right there. That's like kind of like function
when we're
within
passing these
functions.
things into the .css function, there's
Exactly what I'm saying. At that point, you have a number, and then before
these are not variable names,
it's
right?
tree
So
string.
they have to be strings. So we need to
Please
use
use fix and kill me with these. Like,
That's what we're going to set it to this
Oh.
variable. We're going to set it to this variable.
I realize it's on the wrong side of the.
You're like, it's like 95 digits after. I'm trying to memorize 5.
Yeah. So it's always in the upbringing. So what you're saying is you're calling you're finding your body, whatever you're calling, yes, that's fine. You're passing it to the first is the the second thing is the value. So here we want to get the value color, value first. So this should work.
So what is the part you
Okay, cool. So now try to do the same thing for color.
Base 20. What is parse flow using 20?
Do you have like an and or
Here, so now 20. And now this what is
So first thing is that inputs.
Oh, nice.
right now? And now, again, we've got equals.
Right.
Inside first.
Yeah, I
These are inputs, which means that it takes 20 and call a function 0 10. And you can always tell if you're calling a function because you can Sometimes you're good stuff.
Right, so inputs are self-closing.
Yeah, we have a lot of skills.
So we're gonna take 20, we're gonna pass it down.
Joe, this is really helpful, and I like.
Notice that we haven't even set this routing.
Yeah, so you see inputs don't have inputs, right? They're self-closing. So
Take 20.
that was why, that was the first thing, and yeah, you could also like, so you could actually set like your values if you wanted using the
Making sure it's.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally
And whatever that something is.
So you got it.
Yeah.
So,
Right, so
now you've got, right, you've got a placeholder, you've got type,
here.
submit, so it's all really just like, so with the form, right, you've got these digital tags that don't need coding tags, right, and you've got your tags that do sort of that placeholder in the background, value attribute, right, this type text, submit, yeah, now you should have.
50 degrees kind of cold. 50 degrees outside.
50 degrees is cold, nobody,
It's like in the sun.
I would say, I think they're
Now we want to set the value for
Freezing. Anything warm with it? Warm.
like 33, get me my flip flops now.
Okay, cool. Now, let's try one. See if it works.
So that form should get you on your way, so now, what we want to do is,
Slightly change.
So
it's like 34, just a little bit.
minor
So I did like anything.
So let's say
32 to 55.
if cell is not.
Oh, so you had a three,
Well,
you see how like if and else, if.
well.
I just did if, but yeah, I mean, we did like.
Okay.
Okay.
No, that's really, that's
Really all you need is,
Website
like,
is
you wanna make sure you have a submit event tied to the form itself. So you actually won't like, you're not gonna use cells for zero on your.
the type is far, and strings.
Zero. Yeah, so like, I would just say like, get the variable, console log it, go from there, and then user input
Yeah, it is an acceptable way.
Yeah, but what are you evaluating for there?
What's that?
Like, what do you want to evaluate?
I would need to stick that.
Well, yeah, so once I
Convert to cool. So now notice, when you run the function, right, you've got some argument there, and then when you declare, when you call it,
So
it's okay, that's what we're gonna pass it. Yeah,
So it's a zero, it's a zero. And now here, what we do, is actually, let's just set up right here. Back to this line. So now, notice how we took zero, and now if you look here, we also took zero. So passed it over here. It's gonna run this equation, so the next line, that should be 32, right? Turn it back. So it's just back. And now let's see how third one is 32. And finally, let's take it back to yeah, typically it's just like, hey, make sure the else doesn't have it going where I think it should be going, like. And then secondly, it's nice way to just like step line by line. You really want to doing what I expected to do, because or maybe your math was wrong and F was so maybe my math was wrong here. So it's a good way to just like go line by line and like,
So, yeah.
what point am I gonna, does this thing not result in what I expected?
What's that?
So
that's
kind
kinda
of
added CC.
It's so hard.
Yeah.
However,
That was the easy part.
Yeah. Once you like figured it out, it was like,
Just copy, paste code.
Yeah, exactly. You just not have thing.
What I have, and I put out.
But you would still need that.
Yeah.
You still need to know what's in front of you. Now, one other thing, just a small syntax error. Instead of that, you need to see that? Yeah, totally. So I believe that should.
Do the greater than or
Beautiful.
greater than equals.
okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're coming up on the last few minutes of class. So, feel free to keep working. However, before you leave, if you would, fill out the exit ticket. I'll put it in the general channel. As always, we really appreciate it when everybody fills this out. It really helps us out. So that is in the general channel. So please fill that out before you leave. And I'm going to hang out as long as you want to keep working. Within reason, of course. I've got a bedtime too.
So what time is Metro close?
Did you get it?
I'm almost there. I can get it to everything except just for the scores.
But it didn't. Yeah. Okay, that's awesome. Nice.
So I have the JavaScript.
Yes. Okay.
Spend some more time in.
So like if it's a modular 0, I have to
Yeah, trying to make it.
have to keep it in first.
Yes. Okay. So we need this line 8. I just. Yeah, you got this so quickly. That's awesome.
I have a
So as a
Yeah.
Oh, cool. You code regularly?
now here's a college.
Sweet. Yeah, so the scope is just.
What is this?
Yeah, that's
Okay, now you just have a small.
Anybody else have any questions? Yeah.
Sorry, question.
So
So we have function down here to change the fashion. Like
It's not necessarily syntax error as much as.
after reading the second number.
Yeah.
It's
How do we
hard
get
to
like colors?
It's not syntax error, however.
So
it is an
what
error.
we want to do is
Logically,
put here,
Yeah.
we're
Ah,
going to
always do this.
on line 13, just
Yeah,
call
usually
this
that
right
is-
background,
After several times.
parentheses, and we want to just put Fahrenheit.
So this is gonna be
Should be good to go.
is.
Yeah, because now it'll know within the scope of that,
And it's just like.
that Fahrenheit is the variable you're passing in, and then here, oh, you actually need to put Fahrenheit there, in parentheses, yeah. And there, it really doesn't matter what you call that, unless, as long as it matches up with that, because then it knows like you pass in that argument that's what it's about. So you can put like line 19 to be that anyway. Yeah, you can just call it mountains. And then on line 23, yeah. So like now it's saying whatever you pass in, just like
So here,
No, so I was like, okay, that's, yeah, and now I'll say, here, get this number, pass it in, evaluate it right there, and now it takes place.
You managed to get hold of it?
I did.
Awesome. And now that I've found it, whenever the user there you go. It's awesome. Well done. Yeah.
so
Okay. Yes. So. One thing. It's gonna look kind of stressed.
Because all you really care about is that
Typically,
Resetting.
typically we do
Honestly, because this day, because when I was putting, after that. See all on Wednesday. So we just did
Okay, so now one more thing is going to cannot have a creation. So the other things aren't so here you can do one thing, you can or you can go back and do one or two things. In this case,
So,
you're going to be
that was saying that you can always.
Yeah.
Yeah. So go back to the.
I'll just say else. So you're gonna go back and actually.
That is straight to the.
That's not that serious. Your body is serious.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's correct. You say selector, grab value from that selector, and it's sort and now it doesn't matter. Whatever it's considered, how this is another one, right now, trim. And the same also the user has later. SS.
this percent detected 32.7. Okay. So what this does is it just converts it, basically, it tells you to just. So again, it's so 32.
Oh, that's because I went through and changed it. Just I realized
And then
this is.
What is here?
I realized after I had said it that I had used the wrong formula.
Oh, so you're going another way.
Yeah, is that okay?
I still demonstrate the same with the dollar.
So then I went through and I changed it. I just looked up everything.
So what we'll have is $32.
We say I'll select.
Dude, I would have.
Yes!
I did, yeah. Small miracle, yeah.
Which was
Still really low.
so basically, remember how I said pause execution, jump down here, What is there it was, and now this whole thing is now equal to.
Good night.
Thanks for the time.
Yeah.
Really fun.
Good, so I do like this thing equal to $1.
Where would that came from?
Sorry.
And now that we've got our strings that we want to display on the UI, again, more jQuery, we just go find things that I can entries, here. And now when you call again, what that does is it basically just, rather than replace the HTML and things like that.
Nice.
We just want to put it adding to whatever's in there. So initially.
Oh, I didn't see yours, isn't it?
But, you know,
I
every
got
time
to
you want to
change
function,
color, but I really
replace
think it
things
was
that are previous.
nice and fancy like this. It's good.
So, you know, it's gonna basically take this HTML.
I realized that all my
stick it inside
temperatures
of
were
that
wrong
two
because
box.
I was using Fahrenheit
So it's gonna
temperatures.
take
It says cold or hot.
table
So
syntax.
like what I thought would be cold.
You have a table.
So I was like converting it and using that conversion to set line. So
Oh, I see.
they're telling me that it's 12 degrees out. It's freezing. But it's actually 55 degrees.
So, and then this whole thing gets stuck into this key line here.
I have a question.
Yeah.
In regards to the homework.
Okay.
And then we've got, that was user.
Is there a way that you can animate or like do like fades between background colors?
Yeah. Thank you. Have a good night. Is there a way
Like a
to?
hard switch? Like I wanted to speak or like figure out if we could fade between the background and just.
So
Or is that just
between background images. Background images is going to be
Same thing, so whatever.
So we're between- thank you very much. If you're between colors, there's a
Set that to total.
sort of way to do it, which is something called CSS transition. So how CSS transition is just you can say, you can specify in your CSS rules, for the body, that you want the background color property to transition over some period of time. So then, anytime the background color property changes, CSS is going to animate it overall.
Okay.
So you get these transitions, right? You can use these transitions to do like fading in and out.
And that's CSS.
So that's all just CSS. So CSS transition is one way to do it. Now, background images is a bit tougher, because what you're really going to do is
Change the opacity.
you're gonna change the opacity out and bring it back in.
And now here,
So that's gonna take some JavaScript time.
So now we're gonna replace this with now 32.
So there's a jQuery
And it'll
function
that.
called fade out.
Finally, the last thing we're
So
doing
dot fade out.
is.
You can do like fade out, and then once that fade is done, you could change the background or how you can fade out.
by saying dot out.
So it's not as straightforward as just calling one out with the object. Because yes, so there's a time and things that you're pushing.
What it does is it actually writes back.
The next time, this is sort of the next time the code doesn't know how to previous time there. So sometimes there are lines of code that don't happen. Most lines, everything we've done so far happens in 2 years. There are some things that take time, and those things we call good signals. So they happen out of sync. So we don't, the next one is unless you have to do that. So there's this whole other way of figuring out when that's done, and that's
Really? Okay. Okay. So you wouldn't have to, you couldn't set them up at the same time. One's fading out, the other one's fading in. You can't do that.
There's probably a way, for instance, imagine you just have two elements that are happening.
On top of each other.
And one's opacity fades away, and then the other one's there. So that's one thing you can do. Yeah. But there are probably lots of different ways. No, please do. Thank you.
I was looking at, I'm seriously considering creating like a framework for my final project.
Oh yeah.
What's cool is the customized section of the Bootstrap website.
Oh yeah, that is super cool.
It's awesome.
Yeah, it's very cool. We're probably gonna get into that a little bit next week.
Are we really?
Yeah, just maybe not the customizing, but using Bootstrap.
you know the website Code Academy?
Mhm.
It's funny, when they cover CSS, they literally, like, they go, they like almost right into Bootstrap.
Yeah.
When they're teaching CSS, it's just like,
You know,
Bootstrap immediately.
I understand why they do that.
Yeah.
It's much the same reason why we go straight into jQuery, right? Because it gets you moving faster. But in the case of CSS, Bootstrap is you know, not as